there were efforts to preserve its memory from as far back as 1920.
Inscriptions on tombstones, when interpreted, provide background information for fascinating analyses of societies, not just in aspects of how we celebrate the dead or the rituals we use for death, but in a broader and more comprehensive way. They provide collective perspectives on worldviews at given points in time, and they reflect the cultural aspects of the people who created these monuments or mementos. Of course, there's the obvious point that people immediately understand, such as genealogies, but far beyond this, they provide us with an intellectual discourse of the way previous societies have seen the world in which they live, how they relate to that broader view, and how this is played out.
Hello and welcome to Tales from the Tombs. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Today's tales are from the tombs and memorial ledgers and plaques to be found here in the Military Cemetery at Gray's Inn, St. Michael. Our tour guides are Lieutenant Colonel Florence Gittins, Treasurer of the Barbados Military Cemetery Association, and Mary Gleedahl, author of the book Monumental Inscriptions in the Barbados Military Cemetery. As always, we begin with the early history of the cemetery.
Well, the first garrison was established in 1780, and military cemetery had to be provided. In those days, it was below the Iron Barracks, wasn't it, Florence?
Before 1780, there was no need for a military cemetery because the militia would have been buried in their churchyards. But when the British came in 1780, they had a number of people dying from yellow fever. They had to bury them. And they started to bury in about 1790, I think, somewhere around there, at the back of the Iron Barracks, which is just up behind here. And it was a swamp. So in order to bury them, they encased them in canvas, and then they just put the canvas body, wrapped body, onto the swamp and left it. And in 2 or 3 days, it would sink into the swamp. So there were no headstones. Up behind here, all of these tanks are buried. There are people buried under these tanks. Thousands of people are buried under these tanks. And all the area around the tanks, out behind this wall, up to the Iron Barracks, including this cemetery, would have thousands of people buried without headstones because it was a swamp.
In 1796, there were 20,000 British troops here, and within 5 years, 86% had died of fever and related illnesses.
And mostly died from yellow fever. So this cemetery, as we have today around here, was not a war cemetery. This was a barrack cemetery. People who were barracked and they died from natural causes, namely yellow fever. Because all the area here, including the garrison savannah, would have been a swamp. And they did not realize that the mosquito was the carrier. They thought it was a marasmus. And the marasmus was the smell coming from the swamp. So they thought that if you inhaled the marasmus, you would get yellow fever. But then when they discovered what gave yellow fever, they then drained the swamp. And that's how they got rid of it.
And from records that we've studied, it appears this is the oldest garrison cemetery in the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth. But our oldest headstone is from 1820. Sarah Ludford, wife of the late Caleb Ludford, and that's from 1820. She was 40 years old.
Now, when we were restoring the cemetery, when we started to restore it in 1974, all these taller headstones, not the flat ones on the ground, we knew that these people had been buried in this cemetery. We didn't know where, but we just put the headstones up. Okay, so the headstone of, for example, somebody called S. Coombs. We're not sure where he was buried in the cemetery. We just know he's buried in the cemetery, so we put all of those up to commemorate because we had the register that they had been buried.
Before the wall was up, and this was all the burials and no headstones, a lot of the bodies were washed out to sea every time there was a high tide. And eventually in 1923, a group of ladies, the Civic Circle, decided to enclose the cemetery. The British had left by then in 1905, so there wasn't a garrison here anymore. And this group of ladies decided to raise funds and build a wall to enclose this part of the cemetery, which is about 2¼ acres. And they raised £500, wasn't it, Florence, at that time?
£500 to put the wall around.
Put the wall around. And that obelisk, it isn't a mausoleum. It's just where they placed all the headstones that were on the outside of the wall that they found on the beach. So they all date from before 1920. A lot of these plaques in this obelisk are from people who were killed in that terrible hurricane of 1831.
But the sea, which is just behind here, used to wash. This used to be a beach. And when we started to restore it in about 1974, it was a lot of trees had overgrown and it was a bit bushy.
The military cemetery for many years was a wilderness, and it's a place of great historic interest, and a party of very dedicated locals and expatriates got together and they've cleaned it up with the help of parties from the Royal Navy and from the Army and so on.
Since then we've trucked in probably a couple of hundred truckloads of earth to put over the sand so that we can grow the grass and keep it.
And now the military cemetery is truly a place of beauty, and I recommend everybody to go and see it.
And it's what I would call a living cemetery, because to this day, anybody associated with the military, the Defence Force, any of our old soldiers, have the option of being buried here.
And their spouses.
And their spouses, yes.
Not children or common law wives, but spouses.
Spouses.
These headstones are the recently buried persons. You would have when we go to the other side of the cemetery, and this bit here, these are the older headstones. And you'll notice that some of the headstones, for example, that one saying "Sacred to the memory of Colour Sergeant Robert," they're made of English sandstone. So they've been brought over from England. And of course the English sandstone is not living up to our conditions here, and you can see how it's splitting. That's why a lot of the writing has disappeared, because of the type of material that is used for the headstone.
An interesting thing is that this one died in 1872, but we've got some soldiers who died in the 1830s, and as the regiments have passed through the Caribbean in intervening years up to this time, every so often a regiment will send a little contingent and they'll update the headstone and make sure that their regiment's graves are in good order. A lot of the officers who've got headstones, they're beautifully carved on marble. That has obviously come from Bristol usually in England. But there's one headstone here, this one. It's to a soldier's wife, and he obviously couldn't afford a proper headstone, and he hand wrote it, which is a lovely touch. Yes.
James Sims was a schoolmaster from Her Majesty's ship Vacancy, and he died apparently on the ship and was brought on shore.
And two of his students, pupils, on board with the princes of the royal family of Great Britain. One was the Prince of Wales, who later became Edward VII, and they actually formed part of the burial procession and helped carry his coffin. And that's where he is. He died in 1880.
There used to be graves, and one of them used to be what we call jeweled. That is that just like this here, these were seashells, and when they would have been put in, they would have been colourful. But there was one on the other side that was in the shape of a sword, and also one that was in the shape of a rifle. But they've all been washed away. Now you'll notice that over this side, when you look at it, but some of the monuments are sort of not lined up. That's because the sea used to wash in here, and the sea would have washed them into the position that they're in.
I like the way the older graves are higgledy-piggledy because it tells a story of those high seas coming in.
Which is why they put the wall to try and stop that.
We try and keep the modern ones in rows. The other interesting thing is that there's officers and non-commissioned officers buried in St. Michael's Cathedral and St. Paul's, and St. Matthias has got the big H.M. Dauntless memorial to all those soldiers that died of yellow fever, wasn't it? Yes.
And also they're a lot buried in the St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cathedral.
Yes. This one demonstrates the importance of not only taking the information on the headstone, but checking on the burial register or any obituaries that you can find in newspapers. And this simply says that Mary MacLeod died aged 84 in 1867, and her son, her affectionate son, placed the headstone. But when we checked the burial register at the archives, she was actually a captured African. She was 84 years old, and we presume she was captured in the late 1700s in Africa, brought to Barbados, and she was attached to the Corps of the Military Labourers. And we hope she wasn't still working at the age of 84. And at the time of her death, she's recorded as being a member of the Church of England. And you wouldn't get that just by reading that, so it's lovely to find those details.
Now, the oldest person that we know buried is right next here, Mr. Blackman. Yes, he was 105 years old when he died in 2003. We met him, and he had lived a large part of his life in Venezuela, but returned to Barbados for a few years before he died. He had been in the British West India Regiment in the First World War.
This is the first graveyard I was ever exposed to, because again, from the time I was 4 and 5, my mother would walk us down from Culloden Road and walk us through here. It wasn't beautiful as this is now. It was heavily overgrown with bush and so on, but we would walk through, and my mother always, like her brother, she always liked old things, and anytime there was a crab hole, she would pause and look at the earth that the crabs had dug out, because very often the crab would disturb the body of a soldier who had been dressed in a dress uniform, who died maybe 150 years previously. But very often the crabs, in bringing up the dirt from the hole, would bring up the buttons from the dress uniform. So in fact, my uncle actually developed a fantastic collection that he got from here of buttons from every single regiment that ever served in Barbados.
Now, during my research for this program, I was fortunate to come across one of the buttons removed by a crab from the uniform of a soldier who was interred in this tomb.
And so it was these sort of things that I said, my mother recognized that graveyards were not just places for the resting places of the dead, but they also served a historical purpose and a sociological purpose. And so as a historian, I developed that over the years.
Of interest, there's a commemorative plaque here for Errol Barrow,
who led us, Mr. Barrow led us into independence. I remember him well. Yes, I was in Jamaica teaching at Mona when he died, when I got the news of his death. Yes. For ardua ad astra, through the force of hard work to the stars. A simple way of saying, set your goals high, set out to achieve, and if you work hard, there are no barriers that can't be overcome. There are no doors that can't be opened. It all depends on one's personal drive and ambition.
We have a commemorative plaque for the US soldiers that died in Grenada in 1983, and then we have the monument to the merchant sailors who died in the Second World War. And it's interesting to note that more civilians, that is merchant seamen, more Barbadian merchant seamen died in the Second World War than Barbadian soldiers, because they died bringing food to Barbados. And the German U-boats were torpedoing them. So that's a list of people who died during the Second World War. Included on the list is Sir Garfield Sober's father. Now, when we first dedicated this, these were all the names that we could find. But subsequent to that, we discovered 6 more, and these are on the side here. This is the Commonwealth War Graves group, and these are people who actually died during the Second World War, Barbadians. So they're buried. Now, there are Commonwealth War graves all over Barbados. The people who died in the First World War are buried in the churchyards like St. Lucy and St. Philip the Less and Westbury Cemetery. These are from the Second World War. And we have people like J.A. Hockin, who was on board a motor launch and would have been torpedoed and things like that. Now, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission visits every so often to make sure we are keeping the graves in good order.
Yeah. And these are soldiers that died, they died here,
Well,
as opposed to all of the Barbadians that are buried in military cemeteries all over Europe.
These would have died in the West Indies. For example, that fellow probably died in Trinidad, Hockin, but they would have flown his body back.
Yes.
Okay. And the Commonwealth War Graves headstones are all of the same size. They have the crest of the regiment or unit with which the person served. They have the information about the person, and at the very bottom is something that the family wanted put on. Some don't have, some do. So if the family particularly wanted something on the headstone, that is put on the bottom. And they're all white, and they're of uniform size.
And details of them and any decorations they've got is on their website, the Commonwealth War Graves website, which is excellent. And if they are buried overseas, it gives a picture of the cemetery and details how to find it.
Yeah, well, there's a committee that sort of oversees the cemetery. The chairman is whoever is the chief of staff of the Defence Force, and we have people on the committee who are interested in the cemetery. For example, Mary Gledall is on it. I am on it. I am the treasurer, and funds are raised through sale of cookbooks and through donations from people who are interested, so that all of this is kept on voluntary funding. We don't get a stipend to keep it up.
And the cookbook was started in the 1980s by Jill Hamilton, and it's in its 10th
edition. I'm having the 10th edition printed.
at the moment.
Yeah.
She has a very strong interest in the military
Cemetery. Yeah, she used to be a member of the committee, but you know, she's given that up. But there are about six people who are members of the committee, so that we meet a couple of times a month, a year. And then we have a warden, Mr. Morris, who does a very good job. The warden is the sole employee of the military cemetery. He's employed by the Military Cemetery Association. He letters in all the lettering and things like that, and he is responsible for painting the headstones, for keeping the place tidy, and takes pride and good care of the cemetery. We have a garden service that comes 3 times a month and cuts the grass. It's all done on a shoestring budget, but we try. As you can see, this is all sand, so once we go through the topsoil, it's all sand. And what we do is, these are recent burials. This is one from this year. We'll let it settle, and then we'll you know, take it off, smooth it down, plant the grass, and it'll end up looking like that over there. The building was designed by Captain Tomlin. And Captain Tomlin was the first person to be, for his service was the first person that we held the service for. He finished the building just before he died. But in the building, memorial building, are plaques from the regiments of people who are buried in the cemetery. And also, you will find in here this roll of honor. This used to be in the drill hall up in St. Anne's Fort, but was moved down here once this building was erected. These people are from the First World War. They were members of the Barbados Volunteer Regiment, Barbados Volunteer Force. And they were given leave to go abroad and join forces abroad for the First World War and got killed. There's one of them that I always feel sorry for. He died on the day the war finished. Lionel Rose.
When there's a royal visit, they usually come down to the cemetery and do a walkabout.
We accept donations, covenants, and most of our funds comes from sale of cookbooks, the Barbados cookbook. The plot is free. You don't pay for the plot, you pay for your headstone. So the current cost of a headstone is $750, because that includes making the base and then getting the headstone lettered, putting it into the base, and that comes to about $750 these days. There is then a fee of $300, which covers leveling the tomb, and also grass in it, and after that there's no fee. So you don't pay for the actual plot, you just pay for your headstone.
And we don't recycle the graves.
There are a couple of thousand people buried here that we don't know about. So when you dig, you sometimes find remains, which we then have to rebury because they were buried without headstones when it was a swamp.
As expected, there are a number of trees to be found here in the Military Cemetery. They add to the special flora and, of course, create that needed ambience.
I don't know if you noticed, but we've labelled some of the trees because we get a lot of visitors from overseas and they want to know, what are these trees? So we've put labels on the more unusual ones.
This is a silk cotton tree, and we have been told by an expert who visited from England that it is almost 400 years old, that particular tree. There are very few silk cotton that's just burst in ready to give us some silk cotton. And this is a second one, but not quite so old.
Well, as you would have learnt, there is something absolutely special about graveyards. Historian Dr. Carl Watson summarizes the entire program.
You know, graveyards are, as I said, resting place of the dead, but really graveyards are for the living. And you have what's called in Latin memento mori. The memory is memento of the dead. And this example with the anchor and mass grave, types of crosses, the very style of graves, all of these are interesting aspects of funerary architecture. But this is a beautiful place and very restful. It's a place where you feel, you know, you can commune with nature and you remember the people who've gone on before.
My visit here today reminds me of an oasis, a rest from the trials of life's journey. That special place of rest and peace for the military personnel whose fruits of labor we now enjoy today because of their many sacrifices. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. This has been Tales from the Tombs.